Okay, go ahead.
So, hello everyone. Welcome to another session of Humanities Debate. I want to welcome all of you who are with us today, both in the room and both online or offices. But before we go to the topic, I want to do the land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wood, and Chunocton nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Somers Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. Okay. Today we have with us Mark Lojo, who is going to present on understanding genre through journey. In reference to adult pleasure reading of books, novels, genre is traditionally understood through the paradigm of author-defined customs and conventions that gradually develop and evolve over time. Using science fiction as an example, Mary Shelley, Edgar Allan Poe, Jules Verne, and H.G. Wells can be said to have established genre, to which subsequent authors contributed in both content and delineation. So I will leave the rest to Mark and a short bio of him. So, graduate of the University of Western Ontario in political science, Mark subsequently studied theology, cultural studies, and humanities at Wilfrid, Laurier University and York University. After working in the private sector for a while, Mark has returned to university to complete a PhD in library and information sciences. Mark's primary research interest is at the intersection of leadership studies and the academic study of science fiction. Secondly, Mark is also interested in the archival preservation of Southwestern Ontario history and how archives interact with other so-called GLAM, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, institutions as public space. Okay.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining today, both in person and online. I'd also like to thank my committee. I hope I timed it very well. I just passed the comps very recently, so I couldn't delay it any longer. So, well, I need to have something to present on, so might as well wrap it up, submit it, and then get their approval to present. I'd like to thank my ever-patient supervisor / advisor, Paulette, Dr. Paulette Rothbauer, as well as Dr. Heather Hill and Dr. Tim Blackmore, who are also on my committee and who have agreed to thankfully stay on my committee. And also like to thank, among others, the FIMS Graduate Library downstairs for taking a very liberal interpretation of 2-hour loans with me. Also for promoting and helping to promote the FIMS mediation series. And also, of course, Dean Henderson for continued support of mediations. So as Steve mentioned, my primary research interest and the one I'm doing my doctorate on, fingers crossed, is at the intersection of readership studies and the academic study of science fiction, which is a relatively new area, and the readership studies not as much. So I think I'd clarify a couple of these things, like what I mean by readership studies. As an example, there's this one book, anyone from the LIS tradition will have heard of it, genre reflecting. And what it is it's meant to help professional librarians in the context of what's called readers advisory services. So someone comes in, says, hey, I don't know what to read. And then the librarian might interact, might maybe, and I don't know, I haven't actually taken the professional degree in library science, but might inquire as to what books they normally enjoy reading, perhaps learn a little bit about their personality, what their interests are, and maybe direct them to another title. Somebody close the door a little bit. Thank you very much. Before I focus on how much oil that chair needs. Okay, cool. So there's a couple interesting things happening here. So I have in front of me the book, as I say, one of the many iterations of genre reflecting. I think it's the type of book that's renewed and updated every year. This is one of the new revised standard versions of genre reflecting. One of the things that stands out right away is part 1, introduction to popular reading interests. Part 2, the genres, historical fiction, westerns, crime, adventure, romance, science fiction, fantasy, horror, Christian fiction, and emerging genres such as women's fiction and I'm just reading here, chick lit. And it's interesting. So there's a few interesting things that are happening. Another title that says a lot in a short space is the Rutledge Encyclopedia of Narrative Theory from 2005. So it's interesting how the academic community has treated genre as a concept. Speaking of the romance novel, it says the romance novel is a type of formulaic fiction. When you think about it, that word formulaic says a lot. Similarly, on Westerns, it says formula Westerns follow a set pattern. They're often series entries written to specifications. So again, it says a lot. Thank you for it. I'm glad all our classrooms, or some anyways, still have masks that I can use as bookmarks. Anyways, now on science fiction, it's not quite as the book genre fiction specifically is not quite as dismissive. There's like right away, it sort of begins, okay, what is science fiction? And right away it says, okay, this is not an easy question. And there's the heading, a misunderstood genre, continuing debates about the boundaries between science fiction and the closely related genres of fantasy and horror, et cetera, et cetera. So it acknowledges right away that it's a complex debate, perhaps a little more complex than just romance and Western. So I'm not familiar with those genres, so I can't speak to that. But even though it acknowledges that it's a complex situation, it still feels confident enough to delineate some things. Otherwise, there would be an entry here. Also kind of interesting, and I probably spent a little bit too much time on this fellow in my comprehensives or my qualifying papers, Juris Delevko and Candace McGowan. They wrote a history of readers' advisory service in North American public libraries, 1870 to 2005. And it's largely a very critical portrayal of how they see readers' advisory service today. And more specifically, and I'll emphasize Delevko because he's written other articles and books on this subject. He criticizes what he calls the give them what they want approach. So specifically, he feels that public libraries should limit the amount of popular fiction that they carry. The public library is there to uplift the reader, to carry literature, should carry poetry, should not carry science fiction. Sorry, wrong direction. So they acknowledge, it's interesting, they acknowledge right away that the genre identification of fiction ostensibly started as a way to make it easier for patrons to find exactly the type of novel they were looking for. In other words, all novels belong to some type of genre. However, they quickly note that genre has become associated with some fiction, not with others, i.e. genre fiction, by which you mean science fiction, fantasy, romance, westerns, etc. In other words, there's fiction and there's genre fiction, and right away there's a value judgment happening here. And for them, for Delevko and McGowan, they agree with this judgment, and they say they blame publishers for creating an audience and almost holding an audience captive. They say it effectively fragmented the reading public into a bewildering array of specialized micro niches consisting of avid readers, breathlessly waiting for the next novel, urged on by publishers, authors cater to locked-in audiences, waiting for the next novel, urged on by publishers, authors cater to locked-in audiences for specific subgenres and subgenres by repeatedly including what they had determined to be the most popular elements of those subgenres in new novels. So anyone who reads genre fiction will may feel a little bit hurt by that, but I know what they mean. It's kind of funny. We will bring our way of subgenres and subgenres. I have this before. There we go. Okay, cool. All right, we'll navigate into this topic. Now, I've been thinking about these things for a while. I enjoy reading science fiction. Personally, I've been reading science fiction for a while. But one way into this topic might be the novel Station 11. Maybe a show of hands for those here in person. Who here has read Station 11? Juan has. Okay, very cool. And I have. Have you read it? Or No, okay, cool. Sorry, but cool. So, but it's a popular title. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's recently turned into a mini series, and it's published by HarperCollins and written by Emily St. John Mandel, a Canadian author who, upon becoming successful, has successfully moved to New York, fulfilling a certain trope. But anyways, so from the publisher, this is just part of the synopsis. Sometimes terrifying, sometimes tender. Station 11 tells a story about the relationships that sustain us, the ephemeral nature of fame, and the beauty of the world as we know it. So in other words, you sort of get a taste for what the novel's like in its style. In other words, it's a literary novel. So let's get to the question of classification. I'm not hugely familiar with this. I didn't incorporate this into my comprehensive exam at all. But there's a classification system book industry study group, and they have BISAC or BSAC codes, book industry standards and communication. And as it says there, the standard heading applied to a book can determine where the work is shelved in a brick and mortar store, or the genres under which it can be searched for in an internal database. In other words, just basically take some of the subjectivity away from it at the store end or at the library end. So how does HarperCollins classify Station 11? Fiction in bold or all caps, and then they further delineate it by saying general. In other words, so there's a lot happening here, and it's more than just saying it's a general fiction. What they're actually saying is this is good. That's what they're saying, and it is good. I agree with them, but they don't want it to be nailed down to science fiction. Why? Because it's a good novel. Other classifications, categorizations from HarperCollins. So there's two there. It's a little small, but you can see mine is David Paderia's. I haven't read it. Gunpowder Moon. So right away, and they give each of these titles both of these titles have three classifications. First one, fiction, science fiction, hard science fiction, then thrillers, military, then science fiction, military. So Gunpowder Moon we infer is a hard science fiction novel. The Dispossessed, Ursula Le Guin. Right away, fiction / visionary and metaphysical, then literary, and then last, as if a little begrudgingly, science fiction / space exploration. Well, okay, it takes place on other planets, so it's hard to, I know delineation, as I'll get into, is a difficult question, but it's hard not to call it a science fiction novel. It's interesting how they hesitate to call it that. Again, in other words, it's a good novel, which it is. So what's happening here? They recommend a max of 3, and they say less is generally better. And then I start perusing the website, and the question comes up: who decides? They say the author and or the publisher, which I take to mean in most instances would be the publisher if it's a major publishing warehouse. They say, well, they often get asked about this when an author or publisher calls our office or emails us. We recommend you choose the code for yourself. We aren't subject matter experts on a book we've not read, and therefore aren't in a good position to select the best code for the book. In other words, publisher. So my question is it the publisher? There's an annual award that goes out every year by the Arthur C. Clarke Award. I think it's up and down by his estate. And it goes for the best science fiction novel published in the previous year. Station 11 was published in 2014. It won the 2015 Arthur C. Clarke Award. Mandel, at the time, quoting a literary agent as if to reassure her, said, no, don't worry about it. It's not science fiction. And she quoted the agent on Twitter saying it doesn't contain science fictional technology. Now, I'm not too sure what that is. It doesn't contain science fictional technology, so it can't be science fiction. However, she did accept the award. Now, so who awards the award? The award judges, and I just quote from the website, are a voluntary body with members nominated by the award supporting organizations, British Science Fiction Association, the Science Fiction Foundation, and the Sci-Fi London Film Festival, aka readers. They're just people reading a book, and they decide we like it. They're not publishers, which I find interesting. I mean, unless some individuals happen to work in the publishing industry. So that's one area where you see genre delineation being a little more complicated than just an author or publisher defined perspective would suggest. We've also seen in recent years, although perhaps more about 10 years ago, when YA was starting to overtake SF science fiction, blurring of the lines between science fiction and young adult fiction with the series The Hunger Games and Divergent. They're both a trilogy, but they're both a trilogy in multiple parts now, so it's hard to, I have a hard time calling it a trilogy when they each now have 1 of the 3 books. And by the way, you'll see me use the acronym SF In the academic study of science fiction, the acronym is SF. It's not sci-fi, generally speaking. So these discussions are surprisingly controversial among science fiction fans. I belong to a science fiction book club called Science Fiction, originally called, very creatively called Science Fiction London, that meets here in London, Ontario. It's been going since 1980, so it has a fairly long history. And speaking to some of the older members, one of the things they mentioned is we don't talk about what science fiction is. But then, of course, we still do. I mean, it feels like as there's a continual filtering in and out of people, it comes up every now and then. In 2018, we have that same discussion and we passed the motion, okay, we won't talk about it. We can talk about it when we choose books, but once the book is chosen, then we'll just talk about the book without getting into the genre question. But then it does come up sometimes. You propose the title and then someone, whether in person or online, looks at you and says, but it's not science fiction. And almost as if it's a dare. I'm not too sure how to respond because I honestly feel otherwise, but we'll get into this question shortly. In other words, and that's from the film, not a science fiction film, I think I can safely say, 12 Angry Men. But, as those who have seen the film will recall, so it's a trial, those of the jury, it gets a little bit heated. And sometimes it can be hard if you're the only person in the room who has a contrary opinion. 12 Angry Men, they're all set to convict the fellow who's charged with murder. Only one person wants to acquit, but by the end, they all vote to acquit. So there's a lot of things happening here. And my question is, and also another way of viewing it is another way where genre classification can sometimes be interesting is in popular music studies. So on the left is Susie Sue from Susie and the Banshees. On the right is Robert Smith from The Cure. Now, anyone who's heard The Cure will know they're an interesting band. Their music is beautiful. It's very pretty. It's pretty music, but they're also associated with goth, punk, post-punk culture, as you can see. And Robert Smith has been asked many times, "Are you a goth band?" And most of the time, I'm surprised I see, but not all the time, he says no. But then he does some interesting things. He says, "Okay, we're not a goth band," but then he's asked about people who like the song "Friday I'm in Love," and everyone's heard that song, or I'm sure you will hear it if I were to play it. It's a general popular song now. And he says, well, okay, the people who like that song aren't our real fans. They're just in the mainstream. So he's playing it both ways, because on the one hand, he's saying, no, we're not a goth band, we're a mainstream band. On the other hand, he says, no, we're not the mainstream. And so it's a little bit tricky. And also I saw in one interview, he said, no, Susie and the Banshees, they are a goth band, we're not. Aesthetically, I don't see much of a distinction, but I could be wrong. And my point being that sometimes I don't know if the creators are always the best person to make the judgment call. So we're trying to science fiction, we're dealing with a question of what I call delineation and definition. It involves both external and internal borders. External will be the relationship of science fiction with mainstream fiction or general fiction or literary fiction. Also, its relationship with fantasy, which is its own subject matter. And internal borders, i.e. the relationship between so-called hard and soft science fiction. So as I mentioned earlier, also some of this is, the pejorative use of the phrase genre fiction. So to put my thesis, in my potential thesis into one sentence, we're looking at genre from an audience perspective. More specifically, I'm looking at genre from a reading perspective. In terms of delineating the topic, I'm looking at science fiction delineation, definition. I'm also looking at reading understood as a social activity and something that is more active than passive. And hence why I'm here in LIS. So to be clear, by way of delineation, if I may delineate the topic, I'm not looking necessarily at science fiction films or cosplay culture or geek culture. Undoubtedly, people who read science fiction books undoubtedly like science fiction films, and some will like cosplay culture. But I feel like films will sometimes reach a very broad audience. Everyone back in the day saw Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan. Everyone sees James Cameron's Avatar films. And then, so you don't necessarily need to be a science fiction fan to see Star Trek. At the exact opposite end, I feel like the cosplay culture is a niche, and it's another topic. So undoubtedly, science fiction readers it'll overlap with film and it'll overlap with geek culture or fandom. but I want to respect those as separate subject matters. I'm approaching this subject from two different academic traditions. One is readership studies. Readership studies has, to put it very simply, three main currents: LIS, Library and Information Science, such as here at FIMS; social history or cultural studies, especially from what's called the American Studies tradition. So a lot of the things I've looked at are studying it from Americans, identify themselves as scholars of American studies, as opposed to the cultural studies tradition that is associated with the University of Birmingham. And then English, of course. Another academic tradition is obviously science fiction studies. One person, a big name in science fiction studies, was James Gunn, longtime professor of English and founder of the Center for the Study of Science Fiction at the University of Kansas, 1982. I know as you could guess, like that would be possibly around the time that a lot of major North American universities, the English department started offering science fiction courses. It would be maybe 70s, 80s, if I was to take a guess. He was named the Grand Master of Science Fiction by the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers in America in 2007. When readership studies intersect with science fiction studies, you get an academic interest in things like science fiction book clubs. So picture that. Some of us at the 40th anniversary meeting, ironically, March 2020, just first weekend in March. And so there's actually a lot more people there than that photo, those photos suggest. They're just two of the writer and CRISPR photos from that event. And then we're in the Central Library on the left. On the right, we've reposed ourselves to the now closed Fox and Fiddle. Another book club that I have some, I've never been there, but some familiarity here with is Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society. So they decided to make things a little bit easier rather than saying Los Angeles Science Fiction and Fantasy Society, Science Fantasy Society. One of their distinguished members was Ray Bradbury, and they also have some resources. It's probably one of the few, if not the only book clubs in the world that owns its own building and has its own library. So getting into the readership studies, one of the big names that first comes up is Russell Nye, professor of English at Michigan State University. He wrote The Unembarrassed Muse in 1970, which I think is a very evocative title. He founded the Popular Culture Association in 1979 as president of the American Studies Association for a couple of years. That's just be one of the many times you see that phrase come up, American Studies. And he did his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So he points to something interesting in the 19th century, which is the rise of respectable popular fiction. So, you know, like in the academy, respectable fiction and popular fiction are viewed as two different things. He says they came together in the person of Sir Walter Scott. He made respectable fiction popular and popular fiction respectable, which I find kind of interesting. In other words, and you can skim through that, but his books were well read by the populace and respected by the academy. Another name that comes up is Janice Bradway. Her two big works were Reading the Romance, originally published in 1984, and A Feeling for Books from 1997. And she's a professor, again, American Studies and English at the School of Communication at Northwestern University. So from Reading the Romance, she talks about how the romance community is not an actual group functioning at the local level. The emphasis on that is mine. Rather, it is a huge, ill-defined network composed of readers on the one hand and authors on the other. Although it performs some of the same functions carried out by older neighborhood groups, this female community is mediated by the distances of modern mass publishing. So on the left, you have a traditional book club. On the right, you have a reader reading alone. Bradway's sort of bold claim is that the person on the right is engaged in a social activity. She's part of a group, even though she's reading alone. Shelley Rubin is another name that comes up. She talks about the making of middlebrow culture. We'll return to her. Actually, I'll dive into her right now. One of the things she talks about in the making of middlebrow culture, no, I'll return to her, sorry. Yes, so she talks about specifically Harvard University clergy and middlebrow culture. She has sort of a trickle-down theory. So Harvard University promoted among the upper middle class and the clergy certain types of fiction to be read. And they in turn promoted from the upper middle class down to the middle class that you should be reading these books. Now, on the one hand, that makes it seem like readers are entirely passive, you know, just waiting there to be spoon-fed, tell me what books I should read. But what it points to And there is that aspect that it points to is the idea of reading as something that is social. In other words, you're not just going to the shelf and picking up something alone. Rather, the decision has been made in the context of community. So I'll just share this brief quote from her. On rainy summer afternoons, the inhabitants of the cottages for rent along the New England coast or the lakes of the Midwest sometimes grow restless. Tired of monopoly and finished with a stack of current fiction imported from home, they fasten their attention on the well-worn books that, like the mismatched china and frayed rag rugs, furnish the house. And she talks about certain classics being on the shelf, such as Stuart Pratt Sherman's My Dear Cornelia, Will Durant's The Story of Philosophy, etc. This tale of cottagers lets us know that Reuben is speaking of families of at least some means, but not cottages for rent of the wealthy. These inhabitants are tired of their usual entertainment, tired of monopoly, I quote, tired of monopoly, and finished with the stacks of current fiction imported from home. We know, therefore, that Reuben is speaking of readers, of people for whom spending a week away at a cottage involves reading books and playing Monopoly in the evening after supper. These are readers who may be open to a change, so they survey the well-worn books that are already on the shelves of the cottage, certain classics. As these were books already there, we surmise that they belong to the owners of these cottages along the New England coast or the lakes of the Midwest. They are not so much because they are being read currently, otherwise why would they be left on the shelf when other people are renting the cottage, but they are by way of display, and not only display, they are after all well-worn, but display all the same as if to assure or reassure any guests of the reading sensibilities of the cottage owning class, and therefore the edification and enrichment of the cottage renting ascendancy. So she envisions, as I say, the trickle-down reading culture. Another name that comes up is Wayne Megan, Professor Emeritus of Library and Information Studies and American Studies at Florida State University, author of numerous works, and I don't know which one to be the most significant one. In his book, well, I picked one, in his book, Main Street Public Library from 2011, he talks about how he sees libraries, public libraries, as a place where there's a meeting between the people who run the library and the people who use the library. And he says the people who use the library aren't just, they aren't there like students at a school, they have even more autonomy. Users have influenced the library institution in multiple ways over the generations, he says. He also speaks of his libraries as a place and public space. So he sees, to put it very simply, readers as active, not passive. Readers construct community, readers create. So we'll fast forward now to science fiction. Some of the characteristics, traits, or elements of science fiction, this is from one source. Space travel, going to outer space, time travel, alternative universes, everything is a simulation, aka the Matrix. Evil robots, evil aliens, aliens are humans, see illustration. That's from the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers. They're not aliens, but everyone around them is, and mad scientists. So I want to unpack that and ask if that's really what's happening. The term science fiction is kind of interesting because it doesn't really necessarily have a clear history, but to the extent that it can be traced to somebody, it can be traced to Hugo Gernsback, who founded the journal Amazing Stories in 1926. And to be clear, I'm not talking specifically about zine culture, though there's a huge overlap. Zine culture was associated very clearly with those of more refined literary tastes as something that is crude, as something that is not respectable. Pulp fiction, in other words. So when he founded Amazing Stories in 1926, he said, by scientification, so that's the term he initially used, scientification. He said, I mean, the Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, Edgar Allan Poe type of story, a charming romance intermingled with scientific fact and prophetic vision. So Jules Verne, author of such great works as, in those dates, the dates they're published in English, Journey to the Center of the Earth, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, etc., Mysterious Island. H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds, 1898, which Orson Welles dramatized into a radio show. It's okay, everyone. It's not real. It's just a show. It was in 1938. So wait one more year for the exciting stuff to happen. Edgar Allan Poe. He wrote short stories. Mary Shelley, who wrote, of course, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus in 1818. Now I'm adding Shelley. He didn't mention Shelley, but I think a lot of people who buy into his definition of science fiction which has sort of become a fairly mainstream approach. But add Shelley to the list, I think it makes sense. So we're starting to approach here is what you can almost call a canonical approach to science fiction. So you have the four greats, right, and in chronological order of birth: Shelley, Edgar Allan Poe, Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, plus the three Golden Age authors, Robert Heinlein, Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov. Asimov had the distinguished position to say he really met anyone as intelligent as himself. So I see that there's a whole Wikipedia page on definitions of science fiction. And if you're suffering from insomnia at 3 o'clock in the morning, you may want to read it. Now, I hope to give you here a full notes version, and I'm going to be doing a great disservice, no doubt, to a lot of definitions. I'm going to be collapsing about half of them into one, and I call it an essentialist position on science fiction delineation, which sees science fiction through the paradigm of author-defined customs and conventions, characteristics or tropes that gradually develop and evolve over time. These conventions start with the big four, as mentioned earlier, and were further refined by the big three of the Golden Age. Today, science fiction novels have certain characteristics, tropes, and elements that follow this tradition. So that's an essentialist position. Essentialist position, in other words, is there is such a thing as science fiction that exists on the shelf, and you can point to it very easily. I can deviate a little bit from readership studies and look at Rick Altman, professor of cinema and comparative literature at Iowa. He wrote Film and Genre in 1999. He said it's taken for granted, even among academics, that genres actually exist, that they have distinct borders, that they can be firmly identified. He rejects this position. He says that's not the case. So I'm going to go to the exact opposite extreme. And when you see this, you're going to think this is pretty bonkers. This is John Reeder's 2017 book, Science Fiction in the Mass Cultural Genre System. And as you can see, he says science fiction has no essence, no single unifying characteristic, and no point of origin, which is a pretty provocative statement, but it's not quite as crazy as it sounds, I think. Bear with me. It seems like a nihilist definition of science fiction, and anyone who's seen The Big Lebowski will know that nihilists were the crazy Germans. Yeah, we believe in nothing, Lebowski, nothing. Say what you will about defense and National Socialism, at least it was a philosophy, which is another pretty extreme statement to make. But the nihilists were the crazy guys in The Big Lebowski. He's not quite going there, even though it seems like he is. So I say, let's take Reader seriously for a second. If it has an essence, then it must have borders. It must be inherently different from other genres. Frederick Pohl, a major author, wrote The Study of Science Fiction, a modest proposal which appeared in the Journal of Science Fiction Studies in March 1997. And he acknowledges the difficulty in defining science fiction. He says, yeah, it's hard to define, I get it. He says it's easy on the hand to demonstrate what science fiction is not. It is not, positively not, fantasy. And he's writing this to the journal, it's an academic journal, Science Fiction Studies, and he says, look, you, the academic community, are doing us a disservice because you're writing about something I don't recognize. You say you're writing about science fiction, I don't recognize it. And he says, let's get our house straight. And he says in capital letters, something must be done about this. So he's come down, and he's not really making he does say some interesting things in fairness to him in his article, many of which I agree with, but in terms of the question of delineation, he sort of just an ad hominem appeal to authority, and the authority is me. In his article, he says, look, this is how it shakes down. Ursula Le Guin, so if we're going to play that game, let's play that game. Ursula Le Guin sold more books than Frederick Pohl, and she said in her 1974 essay, Why Are Americans Afraid of Dragons? She speaks of the uses of imagination, especially in fiction, in fairy tale, legend, fantasy. It's interesting how she phrases that, legend, fantasy. Science fiction, and the rest of what she calls the lunatic fringe. Fantasy is true, it isn't factual, but it is true. Children know that, adults want to, and that is precisely why many of them are afraid of fantasy. She sees science fiction as a type of fantasy, not to be confused with what she calls legend fantasy, but it is not the same for her, fantastical. So let's take Reader's argument seriously. On the one hand, we have a position that says that there's characteristics. On the one hand, he says, notice how he says, no essence, no single unifying characteristic. So now it starts to clue in a little bit, and no point of origin. Because if you go back to the big four, okay, cool. What about Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels? What about Thomas More and his Utopia and Dystopia? And I think once you start to pick away at these terms, they don't make sense. So on the left, I teased out some things from one definition of hard science fiction. So it's not fantastical, it's based in science, real science. Inside the realm of scientific possibility, nothing outside the physical laws of the universe, emphasis on accuracy, and requires research to write, i.e., you need to look into your stuff before you write it. On the other hand, from Tor, the major science fiction publishers, there's an article that says a lot of works marketed as science fiction have features like sonics, faster than light travel, Earth spinning in the wrong direction. It seemed pretty hard to reconcile with actual science. Also, this is James Corey. This is one of his books in the Expanse series, Abandoned Estate. So it's classic hard science fiction. There's a lot of what you can call world building in there. Like it's creative world. There's certain, the whole world is created just like a fantasy book. So in other words, like the distinctions start to crumble when you look into it. Here's another example. I haven't read this book, but it's marketed. The Guardian calls it hard science fiction. Alistair Reynolds' Revenger book list, DHL world building. And a lot of sources will say world building is not part of hard science fiction. So what's happening here? In other words, I say the terms, I'm not faulting the authors. What I do say though is the terms are not necessarily as neat or as compartmentalized as you would think. Deconstructing soft science fiction. This one source says hard science fiction is closer to current science fiction. Soft science fiction gets further away from what we presently know. So does, in other words, science fiction, you think from that goes further and great, makes bigger leaps with imagined technology. But no, the same article goes on to say science fiction tends to focus more on social science and be more outwardly philosophical in approach. So which is it? Does science fiction make big leaps that it doesn't justify with technology, or does it stay with technology and just go into the areas of humanities and social science? So some might say that hard science fiction has relatively weak characters and is concerned with science, real or imagined. As I say, that's once you dig into it, that gets complicated. While soft science fiction has strong characters and is concerned with ideas from the humanities and social sciences. Complication, I, Robot, written by Asimov, one of the smartest men ever walked the face of the earth, is, as you can just read from the title, I, Robot, it's a profoundly philosophical work. So I'm wondering if we're looking at the wrong thing. We are looking at content when we maybe, among other things, I wonder if we should be looking at style. So Le Guin, she postulates that what she sees as good science fiction has a certain style. And she faults the tendency of the science fiction community to look at content exclusively or primarily. And she says, no, the style is the book. If you remove the style, all you have left is the synopsis. And now what she calls American, she doesn't see herself, she's American, but she doesn't see herself as being, her fiction as being American SF. What she calls American SF, she just means is bad science fiction. But yeah, she criticizes it. The people in SF, American SF, science fiction that's not good for her, are not people. In other words, they're just tropes. They're not actually, there isn't much time to be devoted to developing characters. And she specifically criticizes what she calls the old pulp science fiction, or pulp fiction earlier, is very simple. The only good alien is a dead alien. In other words, you read a novel, okay, let's kill the aliens. Stanislaw Lem, he went out on a middle limb. He wrote Philip K. Dick, A Visionary Among the Charlatans with Robert Abernathy. I think Robert Abernathy translated it in that journal, Science Fiction Studies. And he says science fiction conventions, to the extent that they exist, need to be broken. He wrote Solaris, which has been made into a couple different films. And it's interesting. He says, like, the whole premise of genre is breaking older traditions and conventions. In other words, you need to think the traditions are there to be broken. Philip K. Dick wrote, among many other things, The Man in High Castle. Lamb praises Philip K. Dick for breaking science fiction conventions. Dick's novels, in some measure, violate the convention of science fiction, which can be accounted to him as merit because they thereby acquire broader meanings having allegorical import. And I think Stanislaw Lem reached out to Philip K. Dick to say, hey, I think you're the real deal. And I don't know if this was one of Philip K. Dick's more lucid moments, but I think he thought that maybe Stanislaw Lem, who is from the other side of the Iron Curtain from Poland may have been a Soviet spy, but she wasn't, I don't think. James Gunn, who I mentioned earlier, he edited a book, Reading Science Fiction. In that book, there's an article on there called Define Science Fiction by Eric S. Radkin, who argues against the definition, the essentialist position. And he points to the Man in High Castle by Wilfrid as his argument. And there he is, if you're curious, this way to click. Wilfrid's The Man in High Castle, which won the Hugo Award for Best Science Fiction Novel. So it sounds kind of familiar to what happened with Station 11. Given to him by fans at the annual World Science Fiction Convention as an alternative history set in 1962, years after the Axis powers counterfactually defeated the Allies in World War II. Dick postulates nothing to justify his setting. In other words, there's no science in there per se. If this was outstanding science fiction to the fans, they seem to want science fiction to include a wide range of the fantastic fictions they love, but led by the fans doesn't fit conveniently into the, he's referring to the Oxford English Dictionary's definition of science fiction. In other words, he says it's wrong. And because the Oxford English Dictionary set itself up against the fans, same thing happens with when you take an essentialist position with Station 11. In a way, now, I didn't mention this in my in my comprehensives, but in a way, it's as if the essentialist position is Platonist. Like you're saying that there's, in the same way, like, so a Platonist philosophy would argue that there is a pure tree, or maybe, I don't know, maybe they'll argue there's a pure maple tree and a pure pine tree. I don't know. Jack might correct you, but you know, it exists, it has a real form, and it exists up there in the realm of ideas. And what we see here on Earth are imperfect iterations or manifestations of the real forms. So the essentialist position seems to be saying that science fiction actually exists up there, and what we are seeing are iterations of that. Whereas Aristotle, in contrast to his teacher Plato, he said, "Oh no, you want to know what a tree looks like? Here's an idea. Look outside." So some of my drawing on goes back to Stanley Fish. It's our text in this class, The Authority of Interpretive Communities. And he says, very boldly, literature is the product of a way of reading. He talks about how readers create literature. So I think that's a very interesting idea. Not so much that authors create literature, but that the readers create literature. And he also talks about a reciprocally defining relationship between authors and readers. So to get back to what I call a non-essentialist position, the one taken by a reader, or writer, I should say, it's not that attempts to define science fiction are always futile. Rather, attempts to define science fiction will be futile if made without reference to the audience. In the case of novels, the audience is readers. The so-called characteristics of science fiction that are an essentialist understanding points to, you know, time travel, mad scientists, etc. All these characteristics, they're useful in describing science, some aspects of science fiction, but not defining or delineating science fiction. In other words, we need to give readers credit. As for the scholarship and readership studies, readers are active, not passive. Genre is not a static object on a shelf, and activity is dynamic. Return to Altman. He describes genre as discursive activity. Some of these themes come up in Michael Joe Robinson's 2000 thesis, Genre from the Audience Perspective, Science Fiction. He says that genre is dynamic. He describes it as a process. This was also discussed 21 years ago in the 2002 doctoral thesis by Kim Hoffman here at FIMS, in her thesis, Adult Readers of Science Fiction and Fantasy, the qualitative study of reading preference and genre perception. And she talks about, so you remember, like, we keep talking about characteristics or traits or elements. She says characteristics perceived by the reader, not by the author and the publisher. So I'm going to go in a slightly bold direction now, but this comes from the tradition in LIS, and I won't say their names, but two Scandinavian LIS scholars wrote A Sign of a Good Book, Readers' Methods in Assessing Fiction in the Public Library in 2013 in the Journal of Documentation. That's sort of the, you know, that's a library and science journal, and it's called the Journal of Documentation. And it's based on, they use qualitative interviews, and they're looking at a previous study from 1999 by Q. Luke, and I haven't been able to locate it yet, so I don't know what the P stands for. I thought I narrowed it down. I was looking at like Scandinavian universities. I saw a P. Lucan. So this is the person. But then I saw another P. Lucan with almost the exact same bio. And I thought, no, I don't know now. But anyways, they describe three types of readers: escapists, aesthets, and realists. So this is where I'm getting creative. I'm gonna connect their typology with books. And I'm suggesting is that this may be a better way of delineating science fiction than the hard and soft fantasy. Fantasy is the awkward uncle in the corner you don't talk to. But this may be a better way of defining it. They talk about escapists. Escapists read for entertainment. They enjoy easy readability. They seek relaxation and distraction. They're interested in fictional characters and in action which they want to move along. I connect that with the recent coalescence between science fiction and young adult fiction, i.e. the Divergent series and the Hunger Games series. They talk about aesthetics. Interested in the artistic and aesthetic experience produced by the novel. They enjoy an artistic composition of the text. They want to read high standard novels. I say aesthetics enjoy Ursula Le Guin, Emily St. John Mandel, and Philip K. Dick. They talk about realists. Andy Weir's The Martian is based on a lot of it's based on real science. Extrapolate a couple steps further, as the title suggests. We go to Mars, a NASA scientist is left behind, so he becomes the Martian. And then how do we get back there, and how does he survive in the meantime? And earlier, one of the characteristics of so-called hard science fiction is it has this focus on science, but weak characterization, and generally it may not be as well written. What the definition doesn't hold. Yes, the Martian, I suppose, is what you call hard science fiction, but it's a strong characterization and it's well written. So instead I say, well, let's associate it with a type of reader, namely realists. Realists want to learn new things. And that's how they describe realists. They say realists want to learn new things. And harkens back to a certain professor by the name of T. Blackmore wrote in his doctoral dissertation a few years ago that he described readers who are interested in type of fiction that harkens back to the Golden Age, who expressed interest in reading and learning things. So I appreciate that the concept of typology may be offensive to some. Science fiction has a strong anarchist and libertarian ethos. There's a TV show from the 1968 specifically, starring and created by Patrick McGoohan, The Prisoner. And I'm not a number, I'm a free man. And so I appreciate that this, in a way, this is sort of counterintuitive to go to a typology. Also, I appreciate that the idea of putting people in boxes may not seem very progressive. So I'll take one step back. Rather than putting people in the boxes, I'll ask if there are different types of reading experiences, i.e. the experience of reading or scrolling social media may be a different experience from reading Station 11. So I'm still the same person, but I'm experiencing different types of reading. We've also seen a crossover between science fiction and literary fiction, not just in Station 11, but in Karen Thompson Walker's novel, The Dreamers, published in 2019. So I find this very interesting because I postulate that science fiction is the same way it went on a big change in the middle of the 20th century under the big three of the Golden Age, Asimov, Clarke, and Heinlein. I think something big is happening right now. The Guardian calls it so notice a certain theme here: hypnotic dystopian tale. Kirkus reviews The Hypnotic Tale. Book Browse, a breathtaking and beautiful novel. In other words, well, hold on here. Getting back to genre reflecting and Delepko, who say, okay, you either have good fiction or you have science fiction. Well, here's a bold idea. What if you have both in the same book? Marco Caracciolo, in his 2018 article, Negative Strategies and Role Disruption in Post-Apocalyptic Fiction, professor of English and Literary Theory at Ghent University in Belgium, he speaks of a new trend in science fiction novels with a, quote, stylistically sophisticated approach. Of Station 11 specifically, he says it has an affective power and a distinctly elegiac tone. As a criminal mastermind, Cyrus Grissom, played by John Malkovich, asked the 1997 film Con Air, what is going on? So I think that there's a gap in academic scholarship here, and it would perturb Cyrus Grissom. Well, one theorist we can point to is Michel de Certeau from his The Practice of Reading. Readers are travelers. So remember my title, the title's talk, genre and understand genre and journey. We've talked about the genre part a little bit. Now we'll talk about the journeying as I wrap up. Readers are travelers. They move across lands belonging to someone else. Like nomads poaching their way across fields, they did not write, despoiling the wealth of Egypt to enjoy themselves. And there may have been a few people at the time wondering what he's talking about. He's talking about this, I think. Readers don't necessarily fit neatly into boxes. So a bit of a premise behind genre reflecting is it wants to put the genres into neat compartmentalized boxes. If you view reading this way, the boxes may not be quite the airtight compartments that we had once thought they were, or the Academy had once thought science fiction was. Thomas Tweed, he describes it as crossing and dwelling, which is the name of his 2006 work, Crossing and Dwelling. And Professor of American Studies, there we go again, at Notre Dame University. So he talks about, in his book, Crossing and Dwelling, talks about in Miami, human American devotion to a particular title of Our Lady of Mary. And the whole phenomenon is just kind of interesting because they're looking back to pre-revolutionary Cuba. So they're traveling through time. They're also traveling through space. They're in Miami. Some of the people there, like in a few years, well, if not already, most people were not born in Cuba. They're not just Cuban Americans, they're Americans. So the travel that they're doing when they attend events, be they religious or political, and he also says what is the difference, he's asking, is an imaginational travel, in other words, spiritual travel. And I think something similar is happening when readers do these creative things. When they read a book like Station 11. And I don't know about you, but if you've had the experience of going to chapters, and you think, okay, this book is probably in this section, you're looking for it. Then you're asking, excuse me, why isn't it here? It said, look at my cell phone, it says, there's 10 copies. We're like, okay, well, that's in the mainstream fiction section, or vice versa. And you're like, oh, well, why did they put it there? That's silly. And but anyways, what readers are doing, they're taking Station 11 off the mainstream shelf, they're walking over to the science fiction section, they're putting it on the shelf there. And so it's a little bit similar to what he's talking about, crossing and dwelling or journeying. It's a highly spiritual thing when you think about it. This coincides with, so I'm going to be a little old-fashioned again, Victor Turner's concept of liminality, the movement from one place to another, and he calls that a liminal experience. He's not talking about physically traveling. Sander Klapchuk, presently a professor of English at a university in the Czech Republic, wrote Liminality in Fantastic Fiction in 2012. He speaks of 4 types of liminality or journeying in science fiction, and other types of fantastic fiction. Cultural liminality, which is fiction at the end of the mainstream, or the edge of the mainstream in genre literature, just like Station 11. Generic liminality, which is a type of genre fiction which involves more than one genre or subgenres. Narrative liminality is a sophisticated novel that involves more than one narrator or shifting in the narrative voice from first person to character back and forth. Thematic liminality on the precipice of the real world and the fantastic, which is science fiction. So in the words of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, so long and thanks for all the fish. Some ideas to take away, and perhaps from this research, genre as dynamic and as a process, not as something stationary on a shelf. Genre from an audience perspective, and in this case, the research I'm doing from a reader's perspective. And lastly, the possibility that science fiction, just like it underwent an evolution in the middle of the 20th century, I argue it's taking another evolution today. That concludes my presentation.
Well. So today I get to host the regular host. And Mark, it's such an interesting journey, taking us through the journey of science fiction. It's now time for contributions, comments, questions, views, and what have you. But before I call you, John, I want to set the ball rolling by asking you, Mark, for those of us outside of readership studies, the fact that in your talk you did mention that we shouldn't box readers, and the fact that a lot of us also know about fan fiction. Can you tell us the shared space between your work and fan fiction?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I suppose it's a little ironic that I don't want to box readers in, but I am sort of doing that because I'm looking at the reading experience of reading commercially published novels. And then I'm saying within that reading experience, there are experiences. I appreciate that, especially with science fiction, there are people who read fan fiction, people who write fan fiction. So it is a difficult line it's a difficult distinction to make. Some it's also just by way of, you have to make a distinction and some of this distinction may evolve as I move from my comprehensives into my dissertation. But there is some overlapping research. So Heather Hill, who's a tenured faculty member here, and Jen Koche, or I'm not too sure how to pronounce her surname, they talked about, so there was a academic from Harvard University, the university librarian, which is actually an academic role at Harvard. He wrote on readership, and he wanted to acknowledge the growing scholarship that sees readership as something that is active. And he wrote 2 articles addressing it 20 years apart. And in both articles, there was a bit of a shift, but he largely took an author-oriented shift an author-oriented look at this. Now I'll get the question in a second. And he said, in both articles, at least one, the author comes first. Now he had a diagram, and he postulated, he had lines, people do this, especially in library information science. I don't always get the diagrams because you look at it long enough, start to realize this doesn't make any sense. He had a line going, and it was a line going from authors, but it's a checkered line, it wasn't a straight line, going from readers to authors, and it was a line of influence. So in other words, he was open to the idea that readers might influence authors, but it was a dotted line, and whereas the others were just straight hard lines. So Heather Hill and her colleague, they wrote an article talking about that, and they said it within the context of fan fiction. More specifically, I didn't know this, the work 50 Shades of Grey was originally a work of fan fiction. And then within a certain fan fiction community, it was bounced back and forth between the author and readers, and people gave different opinions on it, and it gradually evolved. And then the author received feedback, rewrote it, and then published it commercially. So all to say, they have a term, they came up with this term called socialization, and they say within fan fiction, a work can be socialized. So if I was, I haven't written any fan fiction, but if I was, and somebody, let's say, gave me feedback, said, Mark, what are you doing? This is stupid. Or Mark, fix the ending. Okay, cool, I fixed the ending. The book I changed, and this happens in fan fiction, I've changed it. The book is socialized. And so they say, so that part's interesting. So what I say with regards to commercially published novels is the same thing happened with Station 11. So Mandel published Station 11. She said at the time, I'm not a science fiction author. Since then, she wrote The Glass Hotel. So a little fantastical. And then more recently, she wrote Sea of Tranquility, which has time travel in it. My point being that the idea that in fan fiction, readers can influence the author is starting to happen in commercially published fiction. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So if you want to ask a question, those online, you can raise your hand, we'll call you, we speak directly. If you think you are okay typing, I'll read it to Mark and Mark. May I start with John?
That was fantastic. Thank you. Really interesting. So one of the questions that I had, it seemed like there was something sort of implicit in your presentation about the status of genre fiction and about how it's, sometimes it's devalued when people talk about science fiction, even Le Guin, when she's talking about Pulp Fiction, it's bad. It's bad. So with your different way of defining genre as being focused on the readership, how do you view the social status that different genres have? And how do you explain how that comes to be?
That's a good question. Yeah, so I think if you look at that typology, and then that typology risks doing the exact same thing because it speaks about aesthetics. Who I think is the creators of that typology are putting a little bit higher. And so again, we're repeating the same, you know, Le Guin is, there's a little bit of irony because Le Guin is repeating the same things which critics of science fiction say. She's saying, well, yeah, that's true, just not about good science fiction. And we're just repeating the same thing. What I will say though is that I think some of that perhaps it may be warranted, like I want to be careful about like the amazing stories that were in, well, the stories that were in Amazing Stories in the 1920s through 50s and 60s. I don't know if they were the same quality as the Verne. So perhaps there are some distinctions to be made, and it's okay to make them. At the same time, I think one of the merits of calling some readers realists is that it says, okay, well, hard science fiction has some respectability. That, you know, like there's a learning element and it's respectable. So yeah, like I think to make a long story short, but I think it may still be continuing, but hopefully maybe diminished a little bit. Thank you.
Okay. Any other? But do you have any hands raised or any questions?
No, not yet.
Okay. Yeah.
In your Venn diagram it showed, it seems that the interpretation of science fiction, the genre, is rooted in the present because it's not yet there.
Yes.
It's in the liminal zone. It's always becoming, right? So
Yes.
it's always forming in that stage.
Yes.
Becoming stage. So are you suggesting that this is something negative, or is that something that gives readers the agency?
It gives readers agency, yeah. And if anything, it's one of the more exciting aspects of science fiction. Now, I got that from Klapsch. I think his name is Klapsch. That's entirely from him. But I think it's a positive thing. Yeah. Yeah, and the liminal. So part of it is it's in the text itself. So it's implied by the text, and then the reader, in reading the text, will have a liminal experience. I sound like we're talking about Philip K. Dick here, but he'll have a liminal experience in reading the text. Yeah.
So if you're boxing it within a genre, isn't that kind of boxing it in a certain meaning? So
Yeah.
it's confined, it's not kind of.
That's true. That's true. And yeah, and a lot of science fiction studies seem predicated on the. So again, we're repeating some of the assumptions that critics or the former academics in the past have made, and then we are different romance or westerns. I don't know, so I need to dig back into this. I think you may be saying that this can happen in other fiction as well, so that it's especially likely to happen in science fiction. Maybe one way of interpreting that.
Okay, before I discharge you, Mark, you passed your comms, congratulations.
Well, thank you.
You have your committee set up. Briefly, can you tell us what the next steps are for you?
Very good. Well, that's a good question. So, okay, in library and information science, we don't have a thesis defense per se, but I will be meeting with my committee. And so like a post-awarding, like post-pass defense in a way. But what I will be doing is before I meet with them, I'll give them sort of like a 2-page overview of what I like to do. And then, take a couple weeks just to think about something else for a while, which is hard to do. And then come back. And then, yeah, so some of these we're looking at, like in LIS, library information science, there's a huge emphasis upon actual field work, which perhaps distinguishes a little bit from some traditions within media studies. So huge emphasis on field work. It's more or less expected, although, I mean, it's not mandatory, but it's almost expected. And so, yeah, I anticipate doing like qualitative research. I can actually see some role for some quantitative research, like survey design. One of the complications that may be worth investigating is, am I looking at people who read science fiction primarily, or people who read novels, which happen to include science fiction, which I think would be kind of interesting. Like the two may have slightly different answers. Like it may be a question of, for example, if you ask student groups to read this, what might their answers be? Or Andy Weir's The Martian. Do you enjoy it, or even just do you enjoy it or not? It'd be interesting if different groups had different answers. So yeah, those are sort of the very, very roughly the next steps. And then more specifically, ideally by the end of the summer, I will submit a thesis proposal. Yeah, ideally.
Yeah, that looks like a whole journey in itself. So we will thank you once again. Can we put it up for Mark?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So we want to thank you once again. Before you leave, next on engagement, that's Thursday, April 6th at 4:30 p.m. here, and then on Zoom, we have Andrew Mello, PhD student, Media Studies. And the title is Necropolitics Illustrated, the COVID-19 pandemic and the photojournalistic images related to Brazil's Bolsonaro. So I hope you make time to come for this talk as well. Thank you so much, everyone. Dean Henderson, all the other committee members, Matt, and all who played a role to make today's talk a success. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to those who joined online. Thank you.